coffee, am I right?
Coffee.
Yeah.
A good hot cup of joe.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to Movie Break. So for this episode, we are going to be focusing on The Light Between the Oceans. This is our third episode in the season, focusing on Derek Cianfrance's work. So previously we have covered The Place Beyond the Pines and Blue Valentine. So we are working our way through his work.
Mm-hmm.
So to get us started off, JP, what were your initial thoughts of The Light Between the Oceans?
So, I think both of us had read the book when we had heard that Derek Cianfrance was making this movie,
Mm-hmm.
and I think both of us, being pretty big fans of his work, read the book as soon as we've kind of found out. I think I read it first, and then I kind of lent you the book. Personally, I was not really a big fan of the book. I found it a little bit melodramatic. Not to be, super critical. I think it just wasn't my type of book that I really kind of enjoy reading. And I think when the movie came out, I think we saw it the weekend that it came out, and I was a little bit disappointed, quite honestly. And then, I hadn't really thought about the movie really until us rewatching it through this series. And, personally, I think I was pretty happy with it, and I thought it was much better than I would remember it. I don't know, what was your take on the book?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I did not really connect with the book. Generally, I am one of those people who prefers the books slightly to the movies, if not much more so. But in this case, I really did not connect with the book. I think I didn't even finish it, for that matter, which is an unusual thing for me. I usually will just kind of power through a book and get through it, even if it's not something that I'm loving, versus this time I was like, I just don't enjoy this. And so I think when the movie came out, perhaps I went into it being a little skeptical because I had not enjoyed the book, and I was wondering, what is the movie really going to be able to do with this that is separate from the book? And yeah, I think rewatching it, I was pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed it a lot more than I had remembered enjoying it. To be honest, I had actually kind of dreaded watching this movie.
As did I.
Yes, and I had thought in my head of like, I don't know if this movie is going to be 2 hours and it's just boring and not enjoyable. I do think it starts off a little slower than some of his other work, but I did find myself actually becoming invested and caring about the characters. And so, yeah, I think I was pleasantly surprised that coming back to it a few years later, I actually enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think, when we had been hinting at it, in the last episode, I think we were kind of talking how, I used this word previously, but like melodramatic. I think I remembered it being very, almost to the point, like, just too melodramatic in the sense of not being interesting, or just kind of drama for the sake of drama. And I remember not being super invested into the love story when it first came around. And, some aspects I think I did appreciate back then. But overall, I don't want to say I did a complete 180 of it. I don't think it's like a hidden masterpiece at all. I think I came into this movie thinking that this was maybe one of his weakest things I've seen of his. And I think I'm leaving with still thinking that, but thinking of it with a higher regard than I did last time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Personally, when I think of his work, I think this still falls in the last place for me at this point. Do I think, though, it's substantially better than I had remembered it to be? Yes. However, do I still think it's his weakest? Yes, I also agree with that at the same point.
I think what makes it maybe his least successful when it comes to maybe my enjoyment of his work is, I think it does come down to the story, because overall I think the acting is, in line with a lot of his work. I think his overall scope and epicness of how he films things still kind of follows in the suit of his other work. Just really the kind of story beats I do find are maybe the weak spots of maybe keeping it from being in the same level as you know, Blue Valentine or Place Beyond the Pines or some of his other work. So yeah, what I find interesting about this too is that this movie really does fit into his themes that he kind of keeps in his other works. For example, you know, family, the F word, family, keeps coming up and up in all of his works. The idea of like making a decision and then down the line that decision having like pretty intense consequences on your life moving forward. I don't know, like what were the themes that kind of stuck out with you, or what made this into a Derek Cianfrance movie?
Yeah, I think actually one of the themes that made it feel very distinctly Derek Cianfrance. Of course, there's the relationship. Of course, there's consequences to actions that come down the line later. I think too, there's kind of that impulsivity to it. Like they make like this one like split second choice and like I'm gonna do this, and then like knowing like ooh, this could have like some pretty severe consequences at some point, but just like the emotion kind of overpowers the logic in the situation, and then later coming to pass of this is the result of having gone with that impulse and that emotion. But I also think kind of that generational piece of just like, I think this is also focused on a lot, and I know this much is true, of just like generational kind of sin and generational trauma and things that you've kind of, what influences you through your genes that perhaps you have no awareness of or no control over. So I think that was another aspect that I found really interesting, just that kind of family piece of just like how are we impacted, whether consciously or unconsciously, by our families and those that either raised us or are in our genes.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things coming from this is that you know, from this movie, the story didn't really work too well for me, but I will say the cinematography and like the landscape of it is gorgeous.
It's
I think this was in Tasmania, New Zealand, so it's kind of this little island area, but just gorgeous. And it really does, I think it's a little bit of lays the groundwork for, I know this much is true when it comes to, I think a lot of the flashbacks in that sequence of that television show, a lot of kind of the old-timey feel and just like the lived-in experience that I think he's able to add into his work is just really really intense and awesome, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a breathtaking movie. In some ways, I would say it's maybe his most like aesthetically pleasing, if I have to kind of put that term on it. I think the landscape is just absolutely remarkable. I also think that, you know, the cinematography can't diminish that, and then the quality of the acting is something that I think is always historically very good in all of his movies, is that the actors are very gifted and talented and able to convey these messages very well.
So let's talk about a little bit about the story here. So the movie follows Michael Fassbender as well as Alicia Vikander. They play Tom and Isabel, and it essentially follows him. He just got out of the war. I think it's World War I, and he's coming to this kind of remote island to be a lighthouse worker, and then he meets Alicia Vikander's character, and that kind of relationship blossoms. Did you, you know, because again, we talked about when we first watched it, I wasn't super invested into the love story. I mean, what did you think about the love story from the two actors?
I think that they're both very incredible actors. I just don't know. At times, the beginning of the relationship to me doesn't feel incredibly believable, or it feels kind of forced to me. Like, and perhaps that's just my perspective of just how quickly things just like develop between them, and maybe there's some underlying reasons for why the relationship moves forward so quickly, but it just seems like it kind of goes from being like she's this kind of beautiful, optimistic girl, and he's this like kind of downtrodden, like cynical character who just got out of the war, and then somehow they just mesh. So that felt a little forced for me, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think Michael Fassbender, he's a really great actor when it comes to intensity. So I think a lot of the movie is him just kind of standing there and having a lot of like deep-seated emotion that he can't really express. So I don't want to say it was miscast or anything. It's just I think he's his best when he's kind of has this very big intensity about him, and I think it was a little bit of underutilized a bit. But Alicia Vikander, I mean, she was really good. We obviously really liked her in Ex Machina. We have the script right over here. But no, I mean, I remember just being very dull about the relationship, and I think the start of it, there are some things that I think work well and some things that don't. I'm not 100% sold on the love story in the beginning, but I think by the end I was actually kind of finding myself getting a little bit emotional and kind of being like, oh wow, this, you know.
Yeah, I think by the end I start to feel very invested in it, and I can see, you know, the true kind of care and love they have for each other. But I think at the beginning it just kind of was like, what is compelling these characters to just be so like deeply enmeshed with each other so quickly, especially knowing that just their personalities were so different. Like, I know the whole aspect of opposites attract and all of that, but nonetheless it was a little like, would this really happen? So that was my kind of take initially, but by the end I definitely felt much more invested, and it felt much more believable that they were in this relationship.
So the story follows them. They end up getting married and moving to the lighthouse together, and they eventually try to start a family of their own, and which leads to them having 2 miscarriages, which in pretty like hard to watch scenes, especially the first one, you know, with Isabel having to kind of walk up during a rainstorm to the lighthouse and being kind of locked out and having to
basically miscarry the child by herself. You know, one thing that struck me in watching this was just how different I think things would have been if it had happened now. Like, of course, not to say it isn't traumatic to go through miscarriages at any point, you know, regardless of the era that it's in, but I think in 1920 there was so much they didn't know about just the science behind it and the medicine behind it, of just all of that. Like, it's so common to miscarry, especially your first child, and then just all of the fertility piece that they didn't know about then I think led women in general then to just completely blame themselves, or people to blame them. And so I think there was also a lot of just kind of shame and guilt attached to it that wouldn't be there as much now, because there is so much more knowledge about it.
And to go through all that by yourself on this island, you know, with you and your husband and those only people, there's not like there's a doctor around to kind of help you in that situation. So. And
really, like, the doctor is probably not going to be, it's not a science that was really developed at that point, so it's not like they would necessarily be able to provide that comfort of, hey, this is normal, or hey, let's point to what this particular issue is that's going on. Like, maybe there's just fertility issues in general that neither of them know about.
Yeah, so the story then follows them to, after they have, you know, multiple miscarriages, randomly one day a little boat shows up with a dead man and believed to be his daughter or his baby in there. He is dead, and then the baby is still alive and looks to be healthy. So the decision, like in every other day at Cianfrance, is, do they call the authorities and notify them and say, hey, a baby washed up, or do they take this baby that they have that have just shown up in their arms after having multiple miscarriages? And unfortunately they make the decision to hold on to the baby and to hide the man's dead body and to just kind of move forward with
as if it's their child. As if it's not someone else's child who probably has someone looking for it.
I remember this was, I think, the best part of the book, and I think this is the best part of the movie is once the baby's introduced and them kind of making that decision and living with the consequence of that decision, I think really does kind of turn the movie into, I think, a Derek Cianfrance movie, as well as just kind of, I don't know, I think it elevates the story quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is necessary to kind of make that turn, and I think it finally introduces the conflict, right? Because I think we're watching this movie and things seem pretty, you know, pretty normal and seamless otherwise, other than the miscarriages. But I think at that point it's really like, you know, hitting this real ethical dilemma that is like, what are they gonna do? Like, in theory, the technically right thing to do, you know, is to report it, and for whoever the baby belongs to, whatever family is left, for the baby to return to that family, and for the man to be buried by his family. Versus also, you know, they deeply want children, and they're at the point where it seems as though they're not going to be able to have any of their own. And what do they do in that situation? And I think that that's when we really see, you know, Tom and Isabel butt heads, because Tom is really pushing, you know, we need to call the authorities, we need to handle this in the proper way, versus Isabel is, of course, after going through the trauma of 2 miscarriages, very focused on, we can save this child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they they do a good job of really rationalizing that decision. I think that you know, she makes the claim, you know, we don't know where this baby's come from. It's probably going to be going into a you know, it could go into a orphanage, or you know, kind of go to maybe an unhealthy relationship, whereas we can provide for that baby and we would actually give the baby the love that it needs. And I think they just rationalize that decision really well, to the point, especially back then, you know, I think it's like, well, no one's going to know, no one can be hurt by this. All we're going to do is just give this baby who is drifting in the ocean by itself the love that it needs. And
although it's quite a reach, really, because it's you know, pretty clear to see the baby is well taken care of. The baby isn't, you know, someone cares for this child. It's not as if that the child has no one, and that, you know, they're saving it from a life of misery or in an orphanage. Like, this child does have a family to return to, and I think that because there is such emotion in it, they're able to kind of gloss over those pieces and those clues that tell them, like, hey, this child does have a home to return to. It's not as if the child is just completely on its own.
And we later find out that you know, the child does have a home. The mother, who is still alive, lives on the same island that they live on. She's played by Rachel Weisz, who I thought was really excellent in this movie as well too. I think just the triumvirate of the 3 of them were really outstanding and really
absolutely
did really good jobs. I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you know, that creates, again, kind of the consequences of that action. Is now this is a small island, and they're discovering of, hey, this woman was looking for her child the whole time. She doesn't know what happened to her husband either. It's just, to her, it's just they were lost at sea and presumed dead, when really that's not the case for the both of them. And I think that when they are exposed to the grief that she's experiencing and the loss that this has brought on her life, it starts to really hit home in a way that I think they were able to ignore before that.
Yeah, man, I just, once they get kind of, because they come back and forth from the main island onto the separate island to where the lighthouse is, you know, they do eventually see that Rachel Weisz is alive and she's missing her baby, and they know for a fact that the baby comes from.
And she's still searching for them.
And she's still searching for answers. She's still searching for, you know, for them, and just wants closure. And, you know, I think one of my favorite scenes is Michael Fassbender realizing that, and just kind of the immense shame that he portrays, I think is you know, was my favorite scene in the movie personally. But
I think if I have to think about my favorite scene, it might actually be the rationalization scene when the baby and the man show up on shore, and, you know, she's able to just really be able to change Michael Fassbender's mind about what they should do from there. And I thought that was just really exquisitely acted and just terribly convincing. I found myself in the moment being like, maybe she's right. Like, maybe they can, maybe they can do this, all the while knowing, like, oh, this is actually a terrible idea.
Yeah, Alicia's amazing. She, you know, we haven't seen her recently in a lot of roles, but man, I really came away with this, because Michael Fassbender, his role is a little bit more kind of subdued by nature. I really came away with you know, I think she was the highlight, as well as Rachel Weisz. I think both of them were exquisite.
Yeah, and I even think that the child in question, so the child is named Lucy by Isabel and Tom, and then Grace by her mom, Rachel Weisz's character, Hannah. And I think that even she did a really great job of just kind of displaying this pain that comes along with, you know, Tom finally admitting what they've done, and her being returned to her biological mother, and being a small child and not able to understand what has happened, and that, you know, she perceives Isabel as her mom, and she knows no different. And I think that that child does a great job of just showcasing, like, what would this do to a child to suddenly think that their parents are these two people, and then come to find they're completely other people, and now out of nowhere you're 4 or 5 and you're being shifted to a completely different home and having to just cope with that. Meanwhile, you don't even understand what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. So once they kind of come back and forth through the island, Michael Fassbender continues to kind of keep leaving clues of just kind of saying to Rachel Weisz's character, like, hey, your daughter is alive, your husband is dead, but he's with the Lord now, and we're taking care of your daughter, and she's being taken care of. How do you morally? I mean, you could tell that he can't live with himself, and kind of has all this shame that he has.
Yeah.
I guess he's rationalizing it. I guess. Do you think he wanted to be caught, or do you think? Because clearly, I mean, you had to think that leaving all those kind of notes and eventually leaving the little baby toy to her, that eventually that they would kind of figure out, hey, you guys had this baby as soon as this other baby disappeared.
Especially on such a small island. I mean, realistically, this isn't a major area where it's harder to put that stuff together. I think that ultimately, I think the shame and the guilt had outweighed the desire to be a parent and the joy of having the daughter. I think that ultimately he felt as though he could not continue any longer with the way that things had been going. And so I think in theory, did he 100% want to be caught? I don't know. I think that he knew it was going to come, though, because he's not even surprised when the police show up on the lighthouse island. I mean, he knew that at some point this was going to be put together and it was going to be solved, and from there, he basically, gives himself as a sacrifice, and this was 100% my idea. My wife had nothing to do with it. Like, stay away from her, focus on me. So I think that he was prepared for those consequences from the get-go, and he knew that they were coming.
Mm-hmm. I think that's when I really kind of find myself invested in their love story a bit more. Of what's interesting too, because it's focusing on the love that parents have with a child, but also the love of their relationship, and I thought that was really well done as well, kind of mixing the both of them. But no, I really, once the kind of drama comes in of them, with Tom being arrested and kind of taking credit for, hey, this was all my idea, I made Isabel kind of go through with it. I thought the drama of that and like them, will they be able to last as a couple, and Isabel trying to forgive Tom with that, and like, will they be able to have a future together? Is he going to be tried for murder? I found all that really interesting. I think kind of the climax of the movie in that sense, I think was really well done as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that she is in a huge dilemma at that point, because she sees Lucy/Grace, as being her child, even though biologically she's not. And I think that she feels, although a lot of guilt and shame about what they did, I think that her desire to be a mother had been able to outweigh that, even after having met Grace's actual mom and seeing how badly it has impacted her life. And I think that her ability to forgive is really impacted by how badly she wants to be a mom and how much she perceives the child as hers.
I mean, could you imagine as a 4-year-old just being kind of separated from your parents and being like, those aren't your real parents, I'm your mom? I mean, what would be going through your mind? I mean, that must be a pretty traumatic experience. I couldn't imagine.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And I think that the actress, really displays that really well, of like her constantly fighting with Hannah, Rachel Weisz's character, of, you're not my mom, I want to go back to my real mom, like, go away. And how hurtful that is to Hannah, knowing like, I am your real mom, and us being separated was not my choice or anything that I had wanted. It just, the pain you can see of her coping with her daughter saying, I want to go back to my real mom, you're not my real mom. So I think that it does have really traumatic, difficult consequences for the child as well, which I think is part of how Isabel and Tom had been able to justify it for so long. It's like, it's too late, it's too far, Like, what is going to come if we say anything now? We've had her for years. And I think that, again, was able to kind of play into the justification and part of why when the consequences came down, they were so dire.
So eventually Tom does get arrested, and they kind of start threatening him with murder. And then essentially Isabel's living with her family again, trying to cope and try to figure out what she's going to do next. They're not speaking to each other. She's kind of out of anger of him kind of, in her eyes, betraying them as a family. And eventually, Rachel Weisz, she kind of comes to the conclusion that, this child, even though she's my child, really isn't my child anymore. I did not raise her, and it would maybe be best if she went back to Isabel's character. And then...
That being said, that's what the condition, of her, initially that is what the condition Hannah to Isabel, if you have to testify against Tom, you have to testify against your husband that this was all him. And at that point, when he is put away or he is tried for this, then I will return.
I found myself watching it. I felt like, like a 50-year-old mom was like, I gasped. I was like, oh no, what is the... I found myself getting caught up in the melodrama, I was aghast that she would ask such a thing. But no, I found that pretty strong and interesting
and dark, because now it's putting Isabel's character between, what do I do? Do I testify against my husband and potentially put him to death because now he's being framed for the murder of the man who washed up on shore, who was truly dead when he came there? Or do I, then condemn him to save my daughter and have my daughter again? And I think that it was potentially one of the worst positions to ever be put into. And I think that grappling with that choice is just unimaginable, honestly.
But she does eventually kind of make her decision, and where I think I got a little bit swept up into the emotion and the drama aspect of really her choosing, no, I rather throw myself to the gullies and not have this child that I've grown with, but to take responsibility for what I've done. And I think that's really, it plays into like kind of the sins and forgiving yourself. She really takes the credit of saying, no, this was also my doing. This wasn't just my husband's doing. And by doing so, they were able to move forward and kind of be together again,
Yeah, and I think that her taking that ownership prevented him from potentially, probably being put to death for it and being completely blamed for the whole entire outcome. And so, I think it was an extremely selfless decision at that point, that she recognizes, not only do I have to give up my daughter completely, but I'm also going to have to take credit for this crime as well and serve time, just like he is.
Yeah, this movie's very like sincere in its emotions. I don't think it's like cynical in any way. It's very not afraid of being one would say maybe corny in a sense, but the whole thing of like learning to forgive and to kind of, Rachel Weisz's husband who passes away, she has a remembrance of basically him saying, it takes a lot more work to stay angry and to be and to hold grudges, and it only takes one time to forgive someone and to move forward. And eventually she does learn to kind of forgive, even though this couple has essentially robbed her of being able to raise her child and to kind of have her as her own. She learns to forgive them and recognize that they were in a tough situation as well, and to kind of let them live their lives and not have them rot in jail for the rest of their lives, to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the end showcases that element as well, when Lucy/Grace is an adult and comes to visit Tom. At this point, Isabel is dead and it is just Tom, and her being able to actually thank them for what they did, for having saved her and for having raised her for part of her life. And I think that it really showcases, although it can be cheesy to think of forgiveness or all of those things, but I think can showcase the power of what that can do, of being able to forgive.
So yeah, I'm pretty impressed. I think we were both maybe dreading a bit of coming back to this movie and in the greater works of Derek's work, and kind of coming into it not really expecting that much, but I was pleasantly surprised. I was just genuinely a little nervous that we wouldn't have too much to talk about or to discuss. But overall, I found myself really, especially by the end, just really kind of getting engrossed into it. I think, again, I don't think this is his strongest work.
No.
I do think this is, and again, we have one more thing to watch, but I do think this is so far his maybe least successful as far as engrossing.
Yeah.
But overall, there's still a lot of things that kind of make this a Derek Cianfrance film or television show.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of elements that really were able to tie it into his work in general. Just the themes that we see in most of his work also apply to this.
So, what are your lasting impressions of the movie, I guess? What, just kind of thinking back on it now that we've watched it for a second time, and I think having a more positive experience, what's going to be your lasting impression of The Light Between the Oceans?
Yeah, I think similar to all of his works, it continues to make me think about just the consequences of actions and just the far-reaching consequences, right? Because this choice didn't just impact them, right? It impacted the child, it impacted the mom, it impacted probably the whole town and island when we're considering how small this place is. There's a ripple effect that takes place, and I think that The Place Beyond the Pines and Blue Valentine, and I Know This Much Is True, they all talk about that piece of just choices in general and the consequence. I do think this one focused maybe a little bit more on forgiveness than some. I think I Know This Much Is True starts to tackle that a bit as well, but I think this one really focuses on what does it mean to forgive, and not only why do we need to forgive for them, because I think that's how we think of forgiveness is sometimes it's like, well, I don't want to forgive them, but actually it's more of a releasing thing for us of I don't want to carry around this hatred and resentment because that's more work for me. So I think that it made some really compelling points in that way and also raised a lot of questions for me about how you go about forgiveness.
I think for me, the lasting thing I'm going to think about with this is really more on the technical side. I think just the engrossment that I had watching this, the cinematography, the landscapes, just everything, even though I wasn't 100% into the story at all times, I just really found myself, thinking, holy crap, this guy's like, a Martin Scorsese, this guy is a Francis Coppola, this is just a guy who is really talented at just being able, even on the ones that maybe don't hit as much as his other works, even his lower tier, I think, are still way higher than I think a majority of filmmakers working today.
I think that's fair. I think that even what I consider to be his least impressive or most not relatable for me is still significantly bounds of where I personally find a lot of film or filmmakers to be. It also made me really want to visit New Zealand, so there's that. That was another takeaway.
Exactly, New Zealand's gorgeous. I think it was supposed to be in Australia, but man, New Zealand.
Nonetheless,
gorgeous.
Knowing it was filmed in New Zealand.
You want to go visit it?
Pandemic time might make that a little tough. I have a feeling they're not going to let us in being Americans.
Yeah.
Which is
Sad.
fair. Yeah. Which I can't really blame them considering how things have been going.
We'll quarantine for 2 weeks and then we can go.
They'll be like quarantined for 2 months.
Yeah.
And we'll think about it.
All right. Well, that was The Light Between the Ocean. Man, I just really, was really impressed. I liked it a lot more than I was thinking I was going to like it. So the next one, I think, is The Holy Grail. I think Kristen's really excited for it. So this one, I don't know. Are we going to have to split up into 2 episodes? Or are we going to have to do
I don't know. There's a lot to say.
There's a lot to talk about.
There's a lot to say. There are a lot of thoughts I have about it, particularly in my case so I first actually watched the show, and then I thought, this is amazing, I have to read. Knowing it was a book, I have to read the book. So then I read the book, and so now I'm trying to separate those things. Like there's obviously a lot more in the book than there is the miniseries. But yeah, I'm definitely excited to kind of delve into that. I love it. It hits hits all my boxes.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk about that next.
Yeah, this much is true. I know, excuse me. I know this much is true is what our next video is going to be. We'll see if it's going to be a one-parter or split into 2 parts. We'll see how much we have to discuss.
We probably have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. So thank you guys again for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.